So we'll finish up this Thursday edition of the show here with me going on for about 15 or 20 minutes or so, looking at some of the college football games that we didn't get to here this week on Bang the Book Radio. A lot of those week in and week out, as we know. And of course, hey, a lot of games out there to try and consider. You heard some thoughts real quickly there on Thursday night's game, Louisiana Monroe and Texas State. I actually like the Warhawks a little bit in that road spot there, but Brad Powers mentioning he likes Texas State in that one. We did touch quickly on Syracuse and NC State earlier on in the week on Bang the Book Radio. Personally, my thoughts on that game can be found over on our Bang the Book YouTube page, where I did up a preview for Syracuse and NC State. We talked about some of Friday's games throughout the week as well, Virginia and Miami. Interesting to see that line moving up a little bit here on Miami, up to -2, -2.5, up from 1.5. Miami, not a team that I would have any interest in here, but somebody out there in the market does. Colorado State, New Mexico, we talked about that line move coming down a little bit on yesterday's show with Wes Reynolds. No idea what to think of that one. Don't love either team in that spot. Do have Colorado State more like a 6-point favorite in that game. So 3 flat, maybe I'll make a play there on the Rams, but at 3 with extra juice or the 3.5s that are out there, not really a whole lot of interest in that game for me. Finally, Colorado and Oregon. Again, for Colorado, tough spot there. Look like they may be getting some guys back a little bit, but tough to go up against that Oregon defense there. Didn't look very good coming off the bye last week against Arizona, but not really in the business of laying 21-point favorites too often in college football unless you've got some really big type of mismatch. I don't know if that game necessarily fits the bill there. So as we move ahead to Saturday here, we'll take a look again at some of the games that we didn't really get to here on the show throughout the week. Game 129-130, Nebraska and Minnesota is a pretty interesting game. Minnesota a 7.5-point favorite here. My line is 7 on the game, so I am right in line with the market. For Nebraska here, you really do wonder about where that team is, about where Scott Frost is with that team. And for Minnesota here, they've actually been playing pretty well overall this season. Tanner Morgan's been a little bit more efficient at quarterback. They haven't really gotten the running game going up until last week, where they really ran the football down Illinois' throat. So, Minnesota is a team that a lot of people did like coming into the season. They didn't have the same kind of helium, the same level of intrigue and interest as somebody like Nebraska did. But so far here, Minnesota's played really, really well. PJ Fleck rowing the boat in the right direction. They're off to a 5-0 start. If I had to take anything in that game, I would probably look at Minnesota. Again, got the ground game going last week, over 6 yards per carry. Yeah, Illinois is not a very good team, but I don't think Nebraska is a very good team either. Looks like Adrian Martinez will go. He's been practicing. I think maybe going with Noah Vedral and trying something different would potentially help Nebraska a little bit. But they will be going with Martinez here. And, until Martinez shows me that he can make some good decisions with the football, I don't really have much reason to trust Nebraska. So if I had to, it would be Minnesota. I would wait and see if maybe a 7 pops, maybe a 6.5, something like that. But for now, 7.5, the prevailing number out there in the marketplace. Game 131-132, Georgia Tech and Duke. This one down a little bit from 18.5 to 17.5. My line on the game here is Duke -17. So no overlay, no big advantage as far as my power ratings go. I do think Georgia Tech may be a little bit of an intriguing team here in this spot this weekend, though, because you've got a Duke team that, look, they're not super accustomed to creating a lot of margin. This is an early kickoff game. Duke usually gets some margin by just doing what they do, playing really well in the process. But coming off the loss to Pitt, and it was a tough loss at that, a game where, Duke comes back home, and they got pretty badly outgained in this game, 337 to 288, scored 20 points in the fourth quarter. It was a game with 10 total turnovers in it. So Duke just not really taking good care of the football. The problem, of course, here is the Georgia Tech offense. Duke's defense is pretty good overall. I mean, they had held the opposition to 13, 18, and 10 points prior to that 6 turnover game last week against Pitt. Only gave up to 340 yards in that one as well. That's the worry here. How many points does Georgia Tech need to score in order to cover the number? And quite frankly, we don't really know the answer to that question. And I think they'd have to score, somewhere certainly in the teens, maybe 14 or 17 points to cover the number. I don't know if that's going to happen. So while I understand the line moving down a little bit, I understand that, maybe there's a little bit of a correlation with the fact that the total is only 49 points, but not a game I have a whole lot of interest in. You could lean Georgia Tech because, again, of the expectation of a very low-scoring game. But I just don't have too strong of an opinion on that one, though I certainly would expect Duke to be a lot better after that 6-turnover performance last week. Game 133-134, Georgia State and Coastal Carolina is a pretty interesting game here. Brad Powers mentioned in the previous segment that, Georgia State seems to be a pretty good team. My line on this game, Coastal Carolina -4.5. In fact, before I started making some adjustments, I had it more like Coastal -2 or so. So maybe my thought process here is pushing me towards Georgia State. Georgia State did run up 722 yards on Arkansas State last week. Coastal Carolina, I think they're getting a little bit too much respect here. They beat Kansas on the road after losing to Eastern Michigan at home in their opener. Blow out Norfolk State, who's not a great FCS team. Hang 62 on UMass, which a lot of people are going to do this year. And then the game against Appalachian State, they did score 37 points. Now, they gave up 56 points in that game. So, I think that Coastal's maybe getting a little bit too much love. Obviously, they're a team really looking to try and get to a bowl game here. And I think when you look at this spot here against Georgia State, I think it is tough to trust Georgia State because, yeah, they beat Tennessee. Everyone thinks Tennessee is terrible. Yeah, they played, and beat Arkansas State last week. But also they've been blown out on the road by Western Michigan and then lost to Texas State as well. So I think there's a lot of unknown to this game. I think it's a pretty high variance game. Again, my number 4.5. So maybe the smallest of leans to Georgia State, but not a game I'm probably going to get too involved in here this week. Game 135-136 is interesting. Maryland and Purdue. Maryland a 3.5-point favorite in this one. And the problem that I have with this game is I don't know what Purdue looks like. Last week was ugly. And it seems like maybe the drop between Elijah Sindelar and Jack Plummer is a little bit bigger than most of us thought. And when you look at that Minnesota game that they played, look, they lost 38-31, but they gave up almost 400 passing yards to Tanner Morgan, who only had one incompletion in that game. So this Purdue defense is not good. Now you have an inefficient offense with Plummer at the helm instead of Sindelar. You don't have your best player in Rondale Moore. I'm surprised to see this line coming down a little bit. I think part of it is that nobody knows what to do with Maryland right now. Maryland, with a couple of impressive wins early on in the year. Since then, it really hasn't been impressive at all whatsoever. So don't want to trust Maryland on the road as a 4.5-point favorite. I get that. Don't want to trust them as a 3.5-point favorite. I get that too. My number's 5.5 here, though, because I think Purdue is really down without Sindelar. And again, I have no faith in that defense, which hits me to the core, man. I like Nick Holt. I like the defensive coordinator. I thought he did a great job at Western Kentucky. Maybe the Big Ten is just a little bit too much for him. Maybe he's just a little bit overwhelmed. And we've kind of seen that play out here in a lot of Purdue's games in conference play. And I think, too, a lot of people just think back to that Ohio State game with Purdue and romanticize about what the Boilermakers can be. The problem is the Boilermakers are not that this season. And really, for the most part, they haven't been that overall. So I would lean Maryland here. I certainly don't love it by any means, but I would lean Maryland in that spot there against Purdue. Looking at a game here in the MAC, Ball State and Eastern Michigan. This is a tough one for me. I've actually got this game lined right about where it is. Eastern Michigan -1, blown out by Central Michigan last week. Ball State, a team that was passing the football very effectively. They play Northern Illinois. They can't throw the football, but they ran it down the Huskies' throat. High variance game, couple of high variance teams here. Eastern Michigan, the type of team that wins at Coastal and beats Illinois, but also should have lost to Central Connecticut State and got blown out last week by Central Michigan. So a lot of inconsistency in the MAC. And I talked about this in that last segment there with Brad Powers about how I've had to adjust my power ratings a lot for the Mid-American Conference. I haven't had really any of these teams accurately power rated over the course of the season. I've been moving them up, moving them down. A lot of inconsistency, a lot of Jekyll and Hyde types of performances from these teams. And that makes these handicaps very, very hard. So no strong thoughts from me on that game there, Ball State and Eastern Michigan. But again, one that, like I said, I think is pretty high variance, to say the least. One game I do want to circle back to here, 137-138, Iowa State and West Virginia real quick. I do like West Virginia in this game here. I know Iowa State's a pretty good team, but West Virginia in their 2 losses, -3 in turnover margin, and in both of those games, teams with 21 points off of their turnovers. Iowa State, they only have 5 takeaways so far in the year. So the base defense has played really, really well, but they're just not a ball-hawking type of defense. And maybe that has to do with the opponents that they've played. A team like Iowa that takes very good care of the football. Baylor, Charlie Brewer hasn't turned the ball over yet this year. At least hasn't thrown an interception yet. Maybe Austin Kendall fixes that problem for Iowa State, but that is a chance I'm willing to take here, looking at the Mountaineers in Morgantown getting the 10.5. New Mexico State and Central Michigan has a different look to it now because Central Michigan quarterback David Moore suspended for a banned substance, facing a year suspension. I believe the appeal process is going on, but Quentin Dormady goes back to starting here for Central Michigan. That's why we saw that line move come down a little bit. Washington and Arizona, game 151-152. Washington a 6-point favorite here in this one. I've got Washington a 9-point favorite in this particular spot, but man, I don't know how you trust Washington at this point in time. And look, Khalil Tate's been very, very effective throwing the football this year. We kind of talked about that coming into the season in the sense that he spent so much of last year banged up with the ankle injury. He was forced to throw the football and just naturally had to progress as a passing quarterback. Well, he's shown that here this year. He's put up some very, very good numbers throwing the football. Did have that one game that he missed against UCLA, and Arizona won that game anyway. And maybe that was a rallying point. Maybe that was a coming together point for this Arizona team. So maybe they are a liver dog in this spot than my lines would suggest. Again, very tough to back Washington. Chris Peterson, some questionable play calls last week. Jacob Eason, maybe just not the guy there for the Huskies. So even though my power ratings tell me I should play Washington, I'm very scared, very tentative to do that here in this one. 5.5, probably the best this line's going to get. So if you like Washington, try to grab that 5.5 or a reduced juice 6. Man, that's a tough game and a tough spot to really put a whole lot of trust in the Washington Huskies. Ole Miss and Missouri here, 153-154. Kelly Bryant seems to be okay after that injury last week. I like Missouri in this spot. If Kelly Bryant is good to go, if he looks okay in the pregame warmups, line up from 11 to 12. I have this one 17.5. So one of my bigger overlays here of the week. Ole Miss they're not a particularly impressive team this season. I know John Reese Plumlee had the big game running the football last week, but this Ole Miss offense, it's a weird type of setup. Sometimes they run, sometimes they throw, sometimes they run out of broken plays. They're just not a particularly trustworthy team here in a lot of different facets this season. It's very hard to find a lot of things to like about this Ole Miss team. And of course, as you go through and look, you're trying to find where they are in terms of the strengths on offense. And it's one of those things where you would expect them to be better than 63rd at 5.9 yards per play, but it's just such a weird dynamic. Matt Corral plays pretty well, then gets hurt. Now they go to this Plumlee kid, and I don't know what Ole Miss is. I don't know what they are week in and week out. What I do know about Ole Miss is that their defense just isn't what it used to be with that Landshark defense, and they are better than last year, 5.55 yards per play allowed. But Missouri is third in the country, 3.64 yards per play. I think Missouri can hang a number here if they want to. I do like them here minus the 12. Again, my number, minus 17.5. We'll see how Kelly Bryant is. Missouri has had some injuries on the defensive side as well. But I think this line is still a little bit cheap out there in the marketplace. BYU and South Florida, game 169-170. BYU off of a bye, a much-needed bye at that. They go into the bye without Zach Wilson, which is a good thing. They did have 2 weeks to figure out who was going to be their quarterback, who was going to replace Zach Wilson while he misses the next few weeks. They're on the road in Tampa. And South Florida with a nice win over UConn last week, but South Florida to me is an awful team. I don't like Charlie Strong. He's even overwhelmed as the head coach with that job. He needs to go back to being a coordinator somewhere in the group of 5, try and get some more confidence going. No Blake Barnett for South Florida this week. He's out. So both starting quarterbacks out for this game. We saw a reactionary line move of BYU from 4.5, up to 6.5 with the Barnett announcement. Now it's come back down to 5.5. Barnett hasn't been that great for South Florida anyway. I will say this, even adjusting for Zach Wilson, and maybe 3.5 points wasn't enough of an adjustment for BYU. I've got this number at 10. So I do like BYU here this week. I think that Kalani Sitake's done a good job of recruiting. I think Ty Detmer was probably a decent recruiter. His scheme just didn't mesh there with BYU. I know BYU's had some offensive injuries, especially the Wilson one here. I just don't think South Florida is a good team at all. And I think BYU, coming off the bye, after playing such a difficult schedule early on in the season, you open with the Holy War game, you go to Tennessee, you host USC, you host Washington, then you go to Toledo. So you play 4 Power 5 teams, 3 from the Big Ten in your first 4 games. Then you go on the road at Toledo, which winds up being a tough spot. The bye week could not have come at a better time for BYU. Now, I get it. They've got Boise State on deck. That is a rivalry game for them. But I do like BYU here this weekend by a decent amount against South Florida out in Tampa. Cincinnati and Houston game 171-172. Cincinnati a 7.5 point favorite here in this game. Total for this one sitting in the 51.5 range. And that's pretty telling here as well. The fact that you've got a pretty low total here for a Cincinnati team that has played well offensively at times. But Houston with Clayton Tune not having De'Aaron King, I agree with the line move here in this one. I've actually got Cincinnati here as an 8.5 point favorite. Should have grabbed the 5 earlier in the week. Was a little bit worried about Cincinnati coming off of that UCF game where they were outplayed for a large majority of that game. They won the turnover battle, won the game. They didn't look particularly great for long stretches in that matchup. But here this week, I think you've got to look at them against Houston. Obviously, it's 7.5, though. Not a whole lot of line value to be had in that game. San Jose State and Nevada is an interesting game. Nevada going with Malik Henry, who we all know, former Florida State recruit, last chance U star, up against an upstart San Jose State team. It's playing much better than any of us thought they would coming into the season. Here's the thing, though. San Jose State on the year, plus 11 in turnover margin. Now, Jordan Love has played very, very well at quarterback for them, but it's one of those things for San Jose State where you've got to expect some sort of turnover regression here at some point. Does it happen in this game against Nevada? Or Josh Love, excuse me, not Jordan Love. Does it happen in this game against Nevada? It could. Nevada, though, going with Malik Henry, big arm, but he wasn't able to win the starting job. He lost to a freshman in Carson Strong. So where is Nevada at? I don't know. But with this short line here, 2.5, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to have any thoughts, but I will say this. As well as Josh Love has played, only throwing the 1 pick, San Jose State is a pretty big regression candidate from a turnover margin standpoint. That leads the country plus 11. Notre Dame is plus 10. They're second. After that, 4 teams tied at plus 8, including San Diego State and Wyoming, who do play each other this weekend, as we talked about in the previous segment. So that's what worries me for San Jose State going forward, some turnover margin regression on also the Josh Love thing. Very good quarterback, putting up some big numbers. Can he keep up here with Nevada? Can Nevada get the offense going? A lot of questions in that game. A couple more games here real quickly. 185-186, Middle Tennessee State and Florida Atlantic. We saw Middle Tennessee State take very heavy money last week against Marshall, and they were very clearly the right side in that game. Here they're taking a little bit of money as well against Florida Atlantic, an FAU team that it feels like they've gotten on track. It feels like they've gotten everything together and in working order here. But still, my number on this game is 10.5, so mostly right in line with the market. But Middle Tennessee is a little bit of a sharp side here once again this week, so something for you to keep in mind in some of their subsequent games here as we go forward. Finally, one more game to take a look at here. Fresno State and Air Force. Air Force a 3-point favorite, was 3.5. Fresno State's been kind of an afterthought here really all season long. They lost a lot from last year's team, lost a couple of games in the early going this season to USC and Minnesota, then a bye week against right before playing Sacramento State, struggled in that game, didn't really look the part too well against New Mexico State 2 weeks ago, and then another bye. So for a young Fresno State team here, replacing a lot with a good head coach in Jeff Tedford, extra time to prep for the option here. I kind of like Fresno State a little bit this week. My line on the game is Air Force -4. So going against my power ratings a little bit, to a degree, but the bye week before the option is important. Air Force with some injuries at the quarterback position. Donald Hammond is banged up. And Air Force coming off of that loss to Navy and a long trip out to Annapolis at that. So I like Fresno State a little bit here. I agree with the line move down to 3, even though it goes against my power ratings. Situationally speaking, it does seem to favor Fresno State a little bit here in this game. So there's some thoughts on some of the college football games we didn't get to here this week on Bang the Book Radio. Coming up on our Friday edition of the show, Westgate Super Contest selection segment with my picks and thoughts for week 6. And then also Brent from DSI Sportsbook with this week's version of the odds report as we take a look at some sharp money out there in both the college football and the NFL marketplace. That'll do it for me. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.